Well, welcome to Impact Thursday Night. My name is James Trevette, and tonight we are going to cover a lot of material about will Jesus return in 2015. And today we're going to talk about a last days timeline. And as you know, most people say, don't put times on anything. Well, of course, I'm not most people, so I certainly don't mind speculating times. So we're going to look at times today and literally take a look and overlay a lot of thoughts that are out there right now and see if they make sense. So as we move forward, I want to start with talking about time, biblical time, key Bible time cycles. As you know, there are 7 days in creation, and the seventh day God rested. Well, that, of course, gave us 7 days in a week, and the seventh day is the Sabbath day. But this is also true in years. There's a 7-year cycle called a schmida, and the seventh year is a Sabbath year. And then there's another cycle that basically after 7 sevens, you get something called a Jubilee on the 50th year. In millenniums, there's also the sevens. There's 7,000 years of creation, and the 7th 1,000 years is the Sabbath millennium. So can you see a pattern here that God has a cycle here, a biblical cycle? And so times exist, and we're going to be talking about times. So we're going to look at how this relates to where we are today, the "you are here" model. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to look at different prophecies. We're going to look at Daniel 9:27, biblical holidays, the Shemitah, the Jubilee, blood moons, the solar eclipse, the prophecy of the Jubilees, the prophecy of the popes, and the prophecy of Netanyahu. And we're going to overlay all of these and see if they point to something. Because all of these are, I guess you'd say, common words that have been spoken out there. But usually everybody treats them separately. The question is, if you overlay them, does it paint a picture? And let's just look at that picture for today. So we're going to start Daniel 9:27. The reason that we said this was a critical scripture was in Matthew 24, the Lord himself references this scripture about the end times. This is what he points to and says as a reference point. He says, as spoken in Daniel, and he's talking about this scripture. He says he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he'll put an end to the sacrifice and offerings, and on a wing of the temple, he'll set up the abomination that causes desolation until the end that's decreed upon him is poured out. Now you remember he's related to that. When you see this abomination of desolation, what are you supposed to do? If you're in Judea, you're supposed to flee. Judea is basically the West Bank. So it tells us there'll probably be Jews continuing to live in the West Bank. But this is a key time. So what he's saying is that we have this abomination of desolation we can anchor, but he says that's in the middle of a 7-year period that's going to take place based upon this treaty. And he is going to return, as we know, at the end of that 7 years. So this 7-year period has to come first. And the abomination of desolation has to be in the middle of it. Daniel 12 goes a little further and talks about from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there'll be 1,290 days, or 3.5 years. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. What we talked about in review from the last time we talked was that this tells us that there's a tribulation period of 3.5 years. So the last of the 7 years looks like a tribulation, and that's also in Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about, after this, there'll be a great tribulation. So we have a model already of what this thing really looks like. And we must follow that model because this is the straight scripture. Now I'm going to hit biblical holidays and then we'll sort of draw a picture of this. Briefly, the reason I wanted to just mention biblical holidays is the fact that things seem to happen on biblical holidays. So when you're looking at timing, it's not just any days are equal. Things happen on biblical holidays. Jesus fulfilled the springtime feasts, and we know that the fall feasts are still coming, the harvest. And we know that there's a harvest coming. So in a simple diagram, what I'm saying is that Okay, let's just say from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, that's the head of the year, the beginning of the year, there's 7 years here. And if something was to happen in 2015, we know that Christ is probably going to return on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, it is the head of the year. It seems to be when most of the people believe that he is returning. And he'll return, and then we'll go through the 10 days of awe for Yom Kippur, and then we move into the Feast of the Trumpets, and on into the millennium. So if he returns here, then 7 years before that is when we got to have this peace treaty. So in other words, if you have a peace treaty here, you can count off the fact that if that's the treaty, 7 years from then, Christ is going to return. And it talks about the middle of the 7. Well, if he returns on Rosh Hashanah, the middle of the 7 is probably going to be around Passover. So you can say that stuff is probably going to happen on these biblical holidays. Pretty clear so far? So if we get a peace treaty out here in 2015 that meets the criteria and says, hey, this fits biblical criteria, once that peace treaty is signed with Israel and many, then that starts the clock. Now, if you're a believer that there's a 7-year pre-tribulation rapture, then you're out of here. So you've seen all the negotiation. They've been trying for 20 years. Every president, everybody else has done everything they can to push peace treaty. And you know there's a lot going on now to try to push it pretty hard. Trying to, shall we say, push Netanyahu out, if you will. Get somebody in there who will be able to negotiate and give it a little bit more freedom so that this treaty can happen, because the world is looking for a peace there. And they've been trying to drive it for 20 years, but they haven't succeeded. So, who is it that's going to control when that happens? Is it the American president? Is it Netanyahu? Is it the Palestinians? Who is it that's going to control that? God, exactly. God sets the times and seasons. So, do we think that Iran is going to destroy Israel? No? Why? Because God said, right? So, we know some things. But God is setting these times. And if this is the return and a peace treaty happens, then 7 years, you can count on it happening. So that's sort of the model. Does that make sense to everybody? As simple as it is, Jesus used this as the key time that he said to watch for. And we're just simply projecting off of that. So that should be fairly simple, but let's start to overlay this and see, because it could happen any year. But why would it be now? That's what I'm going to look at. Well, I did throw some other things in here, by the way. Some of the other biblical holidays, because people are saying, well, you mean the peace treaty's got to happen before Rosh Hashanah? Well, not necessarily. I believe it's got to happen before Simchat Torah. And the reason is, for those people who have studied and know about the 1,260 days, the 42 months, the 1,290 days, the 1,335 days, this is a model for this period of time that if it happened, you can see, well, here, 1260, 1290, we're about 2 days over here from using these holidays. And over here, 1339, 1264, 1294, that's 4 days over. But holidays, sometimes they're 7 days long. So there's things that shift. But so what I'm saying is, don't count on Rosh Hashanah as being the start of the 7 years. It could be the Simchat Torah, which is the beginning, right? That's when they, Don, isn't that when they start reading the Torah over again?
When they start all over again.
They start all over again. So that's a beginning point. It's at the very end of the Feast of Tabernacles. It's like sort of the last day. It's stuck on the end of all the high holy days and say, now it all begins. So that's just a model to show you that's on October 6th, 2015. So if the treaty happens on October 6th, they didn't miss it. Okay? So let's continue on. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to fairly quickly. The Shemitah. The Shemitah is very important because that's what makes this year special. So looking at the Shemitah, to understand what it is, we talked about it. It's a 7-year cycle. just like there's 7 days in a week and the last day's a Sabbath, then the Shemitah is we got 7 years in a row and the last one's a Sabbath. And this continues on. And what it looks like is it's a time, like I said, it's a Sabbath when the deaths are supposed to be released, the land is supposed to take a break. Well, the Shemitah year, actually, I'm going from Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the Jewish year, to what's called Elul 29, which is the last day of the Jewish year. So when I say 2015, the Shemitah year, it actually started in 2014. Does that make sense? Is that a problem for anyone? You see how the Jewish calendar shifts and is about 3 months, a little more than 3 months ahead of us. So that's an important understanding. So here's our calendar year, and this is the calendar year I'm talking about for Shemitah year 2015, which is Jewish year 5775. They consider that real significant because 2 5s and 2 7s. Grace and 7s of completion. Well, how do we know this is a Shemitah year? Well, we've talked about it in review. We said that 5775, if it's divisible by 7, comes out even, it's a Shemitah year. They take it from the beginning. They say, well, hey, you know, if days started from the beginning, let's take our Shemitahs from the beginning. So they just basically say it's a 7-year cycle from the beginning. And if it comes out even when you divide them, then you're a Shemitah year. Well, it just so happens that 2015 turns out to be a Shemitah year, as did 2008 and 2001. So the question is that the real time? Can we look at evidence to say, is this really happening? Yeah, you can read the book, and the book is very good, but what the book does is it comes up with things to substantiate its position. Lots of bad things happen on every day of the year, and you can come up with bad days that happened on that day of the year and say, look, see, this is a bad day because everything bad happened. And you can say it's a good day because these are the good things that happened. So I just wanted to give a general overlook to see if this is true. So I took the Dow Jones daily chart because this is what was pretty much used to say this is a pattern. And I looked to see if this is truly the Shemitah years, then can we see a pattern such that each one of these something is happening? And fortunately or unfortunately, guess what? There's a pattern. It starts out really small in 1980. It's hard to even see the blip, but it's there. There's a downturn, small one. 87, you can sort of see the edge of it. 94, there's one. It gets really big up here in 2001, and it gets even bigger out here in 2008. Notice that the increase between is getting steeper and steeper. So we're saying, wow, man, we're doing really well. Look at this. And then, bam, you get hit. Oh, that's all right. We're going to do good again. Bam. But can you see that as this thing increases, so does the hit going down? So here's how we're doing. Dow Jones is hitting new records. So is there a pattern here? Could be. You know, if I were you, I'd consider shorting in September, or very possibly getting out of the market. And I'd probably do it in the summer because I noticed that things really start turning here and then really take the dive right there at the end of the Shemitah year. And that's important to understand, that the problem happens the last day of the Shemitah year. It's at the end. God says, okay, let's see what you're going to do. And if you haven't honored the situation to His satisfaction or whatever's going on, the end of the year, bam, it takes a dive. So I do see a pattern. And I would have to say, that looks like a Shemitah year to me. It looks like there's a 7-year pattern going on for some reason. Can't guarantee it's the Shemitah, but I'd still be wary. So let's look at the Jubilee, because what the Jubilee is doing is it says this particular Shemitah is really, really important. And this happens every 49 years. Remember, it's a 7-year cycle, and every 7 is another Jubilee. So let's look at the Jubilee. And this is what says something about, is this 2015, is this Shemitah important? Well, the Jubilee is the end of the 7 cycles of Shemitas. And it's when the slaves and prisoners are freed, debts are forgiven, and there's mercies of God would be particularly manifest. Now, does that sound like anything that might happen in the future to you? Like maybe the return of Christ, right? Isn't that when debts are forgiven and all these things are happening? So I would say that the Jubilee year could be a picture, somewhat, of a return of Christ. Maybe he returns on Jubilee. And relative to the Jubilee, it comes out of Leviticus 25. And here's a couple of things I want to point out. It says, when you come into the land, start counting. Now, I believe they probably came into the land on a Shemitah. God was probably able to keep his cycle going. And he says, let's count 7 times, 7 Shemitahs. But I wouldn't be surprised if that 7 Shemitahs wouldn't have lined up from the very beginning. It's very possible to make these Jubilees. So it turns out, it says 7 Sabbaths of years, and then he goes to explain that that really adds up to 49, which makes sense. Now I warn you, some people believe that it's a 50-year cycle, that you have the 7 Shemitahs and then you have an extra year. Now why I don't believe that is, well, let's look at Pentecost. Because it's the same model, right? It's 7 sevens, and then there's one added on the end of it that they're calling at this point, it's the Pentecost. But that extra day on there is not an extra day stuck in the calendar, is it? You know, if it's Monday, it's still called Monday. And we still stay with our 7-day cycle. We don't throw a day in there. So I'm just not really ready to believe that God's going to throw an extra year in there to throw out that cycles and patterns that he's got. So what it is, you count 49, and the beginning of the next year, something special happens. But that's also the beginning of that next 7-year period. That line up, I know I'm moving pretty fast, but does that logic make sense? So it says, notice when this happens, you shall sound a ram's horn. When? On the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Why this is important? Because the end of the Shemitah seems to be when everything happens. But in the Jubilee, it looks like it's right on the Day of Atonement, is when the prisoners are set free. So how far is it from the end of the Shemitah to the Day of Atonement, roughly? Anybody got a guess? About 11 days, isn't it? Something like that? Because the end of the year, that last day, the next day is Rosh Hashanah, and then Yom Kippur is what, another 10? So literally it's right there. And since the way the years work, that's a next year to them, but it's the same year for us. It goes from September to October. So all of this is happening right together. So let's look at that as we go forward and try to understand this a little bit. This chart should be fairly self-explanatory, right? It's sort of the window blind description, but I'm just going to go through it. And some of this is review, so I'm moving a little fast. But what I've done here is I decided to go back all the way to, say, 1900 or so. And I wanted to look at the Dow Jones and see if I could see patterns. So we know that the Shemitah seems to give us patterns here, at least in these last years. And these little red arrows are where there was a significant downturn on the last day of that year, Elul 29. The ones that have a little orange in them, there was a downturn, but it wasn't like majorly significant. And there's only one little period here during the war where they really didn't get slammed during that time. And yes, sure enough, the 1929 stock market crash and all that fits right in there pretty well. So I look at this and I said, these are all Shemitahs here, but let's look at the 49-year pattern and see if it makes sense. So I've got 3 49-year patterns here. One of them I'm calling Jewish history, and that's 1918, 1967, and 2016. The red one I'm calling creation and from the Exodus, and the green one is also from the Exodus. Now I'm going to explain to you why this is important. But if you look at them, you really don't see a clear pattern. Maybe the green one here has a little bit of a pattern because that's when the stock market crashed here, and it does seem to be something going on here. But let's look at the three and see why all three of these are possible for that particular Jubilee year. Because it makes a difference. That's what makes that 7 important. So let's start with Jewish history. Why would I say that I think Jewish history might point to something? Well, notice it says 1918, 1967. Well, let's look at what happened. The Balfour Declaration was in Israel 1918 that gave the Jews a homeland. That sounds like a Jubilee kind of thing to me. Now you look at it and you say, wait a minute, that says 1917. Why are you calling it 1918? So why am I calling it that? It's right, because October is actually into the new Jewish year. So, which is really pretty much when that Jubilee is running, so they declared a Jewish homeland on that day. So that seems rather significant. Well, let's go to 1967. Did something significant happen in 1967? Yes. Obviously, Jerusalem was reunited to Israel in 1967. And it was in June, so it really was in 67. So can you see that it's really possible that that's a 49-year cycle? And if the Jews are looking at this, 2016, which by the way starts September of 2015 for us, the end of this year, could be a really, really significant time. They may be looking for something to happen. Can you see what they might? The patterns might be there. So looking at it, yeah, I would say there's a good possibility that, even though I call it 2016, like I said, it's the end of 2015 to us. So this is what it would look like. We got our Shemitah year here, and it's ending up sometime around September of 15, and we got our Jubilee year. But remember, Yom Kippur is right at the very beginning of the Jubilee year. So you're looking at it and saying, the Jews may see something happening at this time. The Balfour Declaration was like a treaty. And then they captured Jerusalem, so maybe they're expecting, maybe that's a good time to do our peace treaty. Maybe that will be a time we can celebrate and say, look, we've done it. And if they do, then you can count on the fact 7 years later, Christ is going to return. So it could drive that. Can you see that as a possibility? Well, let's look at some other logic. What about 1925 and 74 and the other one, which ends in 2030? So why do I call the 2023 the creation model? Because if you count it from creation the same way you did the Shmidas, it comes out even. As you see, the Jewish year 5782, it comes out even to give you the 2023, which of course is the end of 2022, as the Jubilee year. So if that cycle, it comes from the beginning, the same one we use for the Shemitah, then 2023 could be the Jubilee. But see, that Jubilee actually could be the return of Christ if the peace treaty comes now. The Jews may think it's here, maybe for us it's here. I don't know how that's going to work. But it is a possibility that it's 2023. The reason I also called it the Exodus model is they've done a lot of calculations of when they think the Exodus happened. They estimate it was 1446 BC. So if you take that, add the 40 years in the wilderness, they entered 1406 BC is when they entered Canaan. Remember, the model was, when you enter the land, start counting. But assuming they entered on a Shemitah year, unfortunately 1406 wasn't a Shemitah year. However, 1409 BC and 1402 BC were. If they entered on 1409 BC, a little earlier, then September 26th or 2023 is the Jubilee. If they entered on 1402 BC, then it's 2030. So we've sort of got another vote for the 2023. And if that's it, that could be the return of Christ. Can you see how it makes that 7 years special and lines up? Another interesting thing I found out when I did the counting was if you go back from these times and you count up to, say, 2023 from here, you get 3,430 years, which is exactly 70 times 7 Jubilees. That's spooky, because you realize why. 77s have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgressions, make an end to sin, make atonement for the iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision, complete the vision of prophecy, and anoint the most holy. So that's sort of spooky, isn't it? That it just happens to come out 77s or 70 of these. So that could be duality of this scripture up there. So that's a possibility. We wanted to look at the 1932, 1981 and go on out. We could. It basically, this is the one from 2023, the Jubilee year would be here, which says they make the peace treaty here, maybe, and Christ returns here and sets everybody free on Yom Kippur of that year after coming back and returning. That would work. If it's the next year, that means that we got another 7 years to wait for the peace treaty. And with all this going on, I don't know if we can hold off 7 years, but then again, who is it that determines when this is going to happen? God. Because they've been trying to make this peace treaty for 20 years, but you can see the pressure that's coming in on this thing right now, all over the world. It's huge. The UN's involved, everybody, the whole world is involved in this. Who could have done that but God? He said he'd draw everybody to Jerusalem and against Jerusalem, and they'd try to move the stone. So you can see what's going on there. Blood moons. Let's look at blood moons. Well, what about blood moons? You've heard of them. So I looked at the blood moons. Of course, John Hagee wrote this book. It says something's about to change because of all the blood moons. And what that means is there's actually what's called a tetrad of blood moons. That means there's 4 blood moons together, and they all fall on the Jewish holidays. It's called a tetrad. Blood moons happen all the time, but there's a pattern here, he says. So let's look at the pattern and see if it makes sense. So I went back and said, let's look at the pattern. So as we look down here, we find there's 3 times so far that this has happened. A 4th one coming, and then it's another 100 years or so till it ever happens again. So if it has some meaning, something's going to happen. That's what he's saying. So I went back and looked at 1492. It actually happened in 1493, but the event of 1492 was the Jews were expelled from Spain, or Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? And then in 1948, it happened again. Actually, it happened in 49. But 48, Israel became a nation. And then there was another one that just happened during the Six-Day War in 1967. So they're saying, I think I see a pattern here. So I looked, and it looks like the event date, or the thing that happened, was almost a year earlier than the blood moon started here in 1492, and almost the same way in 1948. In 67, it happened just about the same time, within just a week or two, of the first blood moon. So I'm thinking, well, does that mean it has to be at the start, which would have been back in 2014? So I looked at it and said, do I see something here? And here's my only thought. What if these things happened before the blood moons, But then again, these things happened before the big event. In other words, there was no Israel. Now 67, when Jerusalem gets united to Israel, it actually happens at the very beginning. So for this set of blood moons, could it be the actual end, which happens to be right here? Could be. So it's possible that the event, since this was the beginning of owning Jerusalem, this could be the end. It's possible that if the event's going to happen, it could happen right around the time of the last blood moon. That's my guess. I don't know that that's what John Hagee says. He says something's going to happen, but we don't know what it is. But if these are significant patterns, then something is probably going to happen sometime in this time frame, if you believe that. Now, there's not any blood moons tetrads for another 100 years. So if it's way out here, this doesn't fit. So is something going to happen? Maybe. Let's keep moving through and get solar eclipses, because a lot of people have talked about solar eclipses. But I looked at solar eclipses, and it looked like a pretty wild picture to me. Well, let me show you the picture. There's a picture of solar eclipses. This is the 10 years from 2001, or 20 years to 2020, and this is where the solar eclipses are. There's blue and red. One of them's sort of more of a partial. The blue ones are the fulls. But this is where they are, and there's a little X that shows the center of where they are. But I looked for the correlation between where these things happen, when they happened, and if there's any events. And just off the top of my head, not going into major Fourier transforms and correlation functions. I mean, I just looked at it, and I couldn't see it. Now, this is sort of blown up a little bit. You could say that lately, for instance, right here is the center of one that happened the November 3rd on 2013. And as you see where that is, that's literally just a few miles from where the Ebola outbreak took place, which took place in December of 2013. The zero could have actually been then. So you could say, well, that could actually link. Now, as it turns out, next Friday, there's going to be a solar eclipse, and it's right up here in Iceland. Iceland, does that sound familiar? What happens in Iceland? Nothing. Well, that's good. We apologize to you people in Iceland. What happens in Iceland? Volcanoes. Have you seen, there's one out there right now that's been covering a bunch of territory and so on. Don't you remember that shut down Europe with the volcano? Okay. So let's see what happens next Friday if Iceland lights up and, with a big plume and gives us 40 days of darkness or something. So that could happen. I looked in the United States, and I looked at 2012, May 20th. There was a big one that came across the United States, and there was a large earthquake that several people were killed, but that was in Italy. So I thought, well, that's probably not it. The one that's in September 2015 is somewhere down in Antarctica, down here. Probably not going to see it. The one that might make me nervous, if there is a pattern, is this one right here. The center of it just happens to be around the Madrid Fault on August 21st, 2017. So, just for your vacation planning. So I just didn't see it, okay? So I'm not going to claim that. Now, there may be some patterns here. Don?
What brings these, causes me pause on these, is the prophecies that refer to, and forgive me if I'm stepping on you.
No, go.
Am I stepping on you?
No, not at all.
Okay. The prophecies that refer to the moon will turn blood and the sun will be darkened.
Yes.
So here we are with the tetrad, and in the middle of the tetrad we have these total lunar eclipses that are basically within a month of the lunar eclipses that are associated with the Jewish holidays.
Yes. So what he's saying is, blood moons, by the way, are just lunar eclipses, okay? They happen all the time. It was the tetrad pattern that really set this thing off. What he's saying is that could it be that there is a pattern here that only when it links in with other events could be there? And the answer is yes, it could. But I, at this point, have not been able to find that pattern and how it related, because there hasn't been a lot of tetrads out there. So, you know, I don't know how it's going to line up, or days when there's these two, just the two are close together. But that would be a good study if someone out there wants to do it. And OJ.
When Jesus died, was eclipse that made the earth dark, or was it God that did it?
When Jesus died, there was a lunar eclipse when Jesus died, but it was below the horizon. But the day that he was, because Passovers are always on a full moon, so Jesus was crucified on a full moon. You know, it's just by definition. And there was a lunar eclipse below the horizon in Israel when Jesus.
What's that mean, below the horizon? What's the significance?
Well, that means that it's somewhere over here,
Yeah.
that they couldn't see it from here.
You couldn't see it, but
So it may not, you know, be specific to the location of it. Because like I said, the one from September here, which is on the holiday he's talking about, is somewhere in Antarctica that lines up with the blood moon. So, yes?
Yeah, I was watching TBN and they said the other night that on March the 20th, that's the exact same time.
It's this one?
Yeah, March 20th, the solar eclipse. Back in Moses' day, that's the day that the fire fell from heaven and lit the candle inside the wilderness tabernacle.
May have been. I didn't, you know, I haven't studied to that degree, but anybody that's out there, hey, let me know, okay? Because I'm just trying to put the pieces together. Because, like I said, there's lots of ways that you can take a particular event and try to say, hey, this is really something because look what happened. But until you look at the whole picture and look at when else it happened, you know, you really can't say, hey, I see the pattern here that the Lord has put in it. Scriptural is the best thing, of course. So we're going to move on to the prophecy of what's called the Jubilees. This was done by Rabbi Judah ben Samuel, and he did it back in 1217. He made this prophecy, and this was the prophecy, obviously translated. When the Ottomans conquer Jerusalem, they will rule over Jerusalem for 8 jubilees. Afterwards, Jerusalem will become a no man's land for 1 jubilee. And then in the 9th Jubilee, it will once again come back into the possession of the Jewish nation, which would signify the beginning of the Messianic end time. Now, he was using a 50-year period. So what he said was, he did this on 1217, and lo and behold, if it didn't really happen, in about 1517, the Ottomans, who he actually sort of named, came in and took it over, Jerusalem, in 1517. And they held it for exactly 400 years until 1917. You remember that date? The Balfour Declaration? Well, the Ottomans left it in 1917, and then the Balfour Declaration came, and it was sort of in no man's land until 1967. So if this is every 50 years, what it says is, so far he's doing pretty good, and now the Jews have had it for 50 years, which means sometime in 2017, they're going to lose it, or something's going to happen here, because it says the beginning of the Messianic end times. So that looks like it's, I mean, if you look 50 years from now, you're saying, well, that wouldn't line up with then. Something's going to happen now, according to this. So and you understand, we're talking about thousands of years, and we're down to like months and a year or two here. You know, we're talking about the last 4 seconds of the 4th quarter here. OJ. Basically, you can see the pattern that sometime here, theoretically, Jerusalem's going to have to go to the Gentiles in 2017, if this happens. Which, you know, we don't know that, but that's just a...
that treaty where they want to roll back the borders of Israel to before 1967?
Yeah.
Well, yes, and you know what my belief on that is, that of course my belief is that if we force Israel to go back to 1967, then we're going to go back to 1967, which, by the way, it looks a whole lot like that right now. So if you remember what was going on in 67. So let's go ahead. Prophecy of the popes. Well, the prophecy of the popes was the one, you might be familiar with this, that it was done back in 1140 by the Saint Malachi, or however you say it, Malachi, or whatever his name is. Anyway, he had a prophecy of 112 what's called short phrases, or they were literally for the popes to come. And so they've been following these 112, whether this is true or not, whatever, they've got the stuff at the Vatican, but they've been following it, and they've been doing the counts, and guess whose number? 112. Right, you know, yes, Francis is 112 according to that. Now the prophecy over the last one was this: in the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep in many tribulations, and when these things are finished, the city of the 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people, the end. That's the wording that he gave. So he's saying, hey, the last pope, this is the way it's going to happen. And if you count it up, it does look a whole lot like number 112 is, sure enough, Pope Francis. And there was a book out there that was written about that to show that his parents, I mean, Bergoglio or I'm not Italian, but the fact is he's obviously Italian, even though he came from South America. Both his parents were Italian. So he is, and he does have the name originally, De Pietro, which is Peter. So you could say, yeah, it could be Peter the Roman. You know, we could go with that. But the key thing is, he goes by the name Francis because he took it from Francis of Assisi. Well, lo and behold, I went and looked, and guess what? Francis of Assisi has a prophecy of the last days. And here's was his prophecy. He said, at the time of this tribulation, a man not canonically elected will raise to the pontificate, who with cunning will endeavor to draw many into error and into death. For in those days, Jesus Christ will send them not a true pastor, but a destroyer. Which is interesting, because that would indicate that somebody's going to rise to power at this time. So, you know, these are, is it a coincidence? Don't know. I'm just laying out the facts. So if it is him, we got to look at the fact that, let's see, I figure he's 78 this year. Happy birthday sometime. And if it's 20 years from now, he'd be really, really old. So, yes. Yeah, well, okay. But okay, but you know, 20 plus 78, that's starting to get old. Okay, well, you give me that, 98 is starting. So if it's going to happen and it is him, and he's going to be around during the time of the tribulation to usher his lambs through this time, he's going to have to get on with it. Because his age is starting to get up there. So that's my point. I mean, just if that prophecy is true, then you got to look at the reality of that. And prophecy of Netanyahu, you guys might know about Michael Evans, who is a New York Times bestseller and so on. Well, he tells the clear story that he was, I believe was in Israel at the time, and he was meeting with the family because he knew the family, the father, and they were there mourning over the death of Netanyahu's brother, who had died like 4 years before that. And you remember who Netanyahu's brother was, right? He was the guy who led the raid on Entebbe. And he was the only person to die in that raid. So what happened was they were basically mourning that, and he went over to the family, and he gave a prophecy. A recorded prophecy over Netanyahu. Here's a picture of when that happened. Netanyahu looks a little younger, and so does he. But he said, Benjamin Netanyahu walked into the room, As we spoke, and I could see the agony on his face because of the death of his beloved brother. I wept and asked if I could pray for him. I'll never forget the words God gave me on that day. I said, "You love Jonathan, and out of the ashes of your despair will come strength from God. You will be the prime minister of Israel twice." And he says he wasn't even interested in politics at the time. "And a second time will be in the most dangerous days of Israel's history." He says, "I took a small bottle of oil I had purchased at the garden tomb and anointed his head." And here's a picture of them, of course, more recently together. It seems to be like it worked. I mean, whatever, yes.
How many terms has he served already?
He's served several terms, probably 3 or 4, but he's only been prime minister twice.
Okay, got it.
He was once, and then there was someone in between.
So he's already been twice, right?
Oh yes, this is his second time, which would mean it would have to be during the most dangerous days of Israel's history. Well, if you look at that picture, how that fits, you know they've called for elections here on March 17th, which next week, to see who's going to be prime minister. And that term is 4 years, which would take them right almost exactly to the abomination of desolation. So if he's going to be the guy, he's going to have to win this election. And there's a lot of things going against him, believe it or not. So could this happen? I mean, let's face it, he's not going to be, that's going to put him at 70 here. So once again, not to overdo the age thing, but it's probably not going to be 20 or 30 years from now if Netanyahu's going to be around. So it does sort of line up that something's got to happen soon. So finally, by 2019, could we see? For this to happen in 2019, we'd have to see some things. A one world government, because the Antichrist is going to need a one world government to take control. We're going to have to see one world financial system because he's going to need that to implement the mark. A one world church is going to be needed because he's going to need this false prophet to come up. He's going to need the third Jewish temple because he's going to have to go in there and claim to be Christ. And of course, the new Babylon is going to have to appear because the Antichrist is going to meet a city of grandeur as his capital. So that means all that stuff would have to happen by 2019 if we're on target.
I think you suggested once, just curious, you thought maybe it could be
Dubai. Dubai could be the city of grandeur. Oh, yeah, absolutely. It just happens to be on the Euphrates, sort of, and fit a lot of the... So yes, it looks like it fits the tallest building, the greatest of everything. They even got the Babylon Hanging Gardens they're building. So yeah, it's amazing what they're doing in Dubai. Plus, it's a perfect place for it. Because it is the hub, it is the seaport. Not only that, it's literally what owns ports. I mean, that's the major shipping hub and aerial hub for the time. Yes, Jay?
Why couldn't it be New York City?
It could be. But the reason I think it's Dubai is just because I believe that New York City did have the tallest building and was the financial capital pretty much of the world. But I think when the Antichrist comes, I believe he's going to shift it because, whatever's going on with the Muslim nations and so on, it's a neutral, it's a small little country sitting out there. It's right in the center of the world. It has all the world trade. So to bring the world together, it's possible. It could. I'm not saying it's not New York City.
Some of the most significant, wealthiest people in the world are moving to that.
Yeah, it's the new everything. It's the new Las Vegas. It's the new. But anyway, if you look at it, you'll see that somehow in the last 20 years, it's come from a pile of dirt into the most city of great grandeur, and that could be. So one way or another, whether it's New York City or Dubai, it's possible. All these things are possible. We know, for instance, the One World Church. We think that it's going to be all the religions coming together, but it may not be. It may be the URI. This is sort of how it's happening. We'll just talk one world government. It could be the UN, the G20. Just keep an eye on them and how these things come together. The one world financial system, the G20 and the IMF, if they work toward a world currency. The One World Church, that could be the URI, the United Religions Initiative, which is like the United Nations. They basically, after all, the nations have come together, but it doesn't mean the act is one. they're still individual nations. Well, the URI already has a charter to bring all the religions under one head and still respect, quote, the traditions of each religion. And it's a sort of UN type of thing to come together. So watch for that, because that could easily be the place where it comes together. The third Jewish temple, like we talked about, gee, what if it's really the city of David? This could happen. For instance, I don't know if you've seen Bob Cornu's research that he's been doing? Anybody seen that? He has gone through the Bible and done all the research and dug up the fact that he believes that the temple is not on the Temple Mount, because that really wasn't the Temple Mount. And he's got an incredible proof that says that was the Roman garrison fort, that the Temple Mount is actually in the city of David. In the last month, they've actually dug down and found things that looked like the floor where the blood sacrifices were made, with grooves in the floor and all that. Which means that could change everything, because that means they could rebuild the temple. And of course the New Babylon, I believe that could be Dubai. Watch to see if the UN moves to Dubai, which, by the way, the Dubai has tried to get them to move there. So that's it. Question. Yeah, I don't know. But I'm just saying, we sort of covered the waterfront here. Something looks like it's going to happen soon. Is it going to be this year? Everything's about the scripture that says there's got to be this 7-year period. And what you believe about the rapture is really, really important, because if you believe that, watch for the negotiations, and when it's about to happen, prepare your way, because you're going to be out of here. I think we're going to be around for a while, personally. That's just my view, but that's the way I see it.